Good evening, everyone. Could I just warmly welcome you here to Maze tonight? And this is the last of our 4 talks that we've hosted this year. We had 2 previous talks, one on grief and one on depression earlier in the year. And then last week we had suffering and a God of love. And tonight we're going to look at a very common condition that many people today struggle with, and that is stress and anxiety. Tonight I would like to introduce our speaker, who is Ken Yeow. Ken is a consultant psychiatrist working in the NHS here in Northern Ireland. Following his talk, we will have a question and answer session. So if there's anybody who wants to ask questions, then I will, if you put your hand up, I'll come to you with the microphone. Following that, there will be tea and coffee in the welcome area, and there's also a bookstall out there if you would have a little look at that as well. Thank you. Ken?
Thanks, Annette. Got a dry mouth already. Must be anxiety. Right. Thank you so much for the invitation. Let me just test this, okay. Real pleasure to be here this evening, such a joy. Thank you for coming out. We're going to be thinking together about this topic, stress and anxiety. And as Annette said, very happy to take questions at the end and see what comes up. So I'll throw out a few things to you and we'll see what comes back. I'm very happy for disagreements and debates and querying and checking things out. So, because I don't know everything about this, and I certainly don't have all the answers either. Now, yeah. Let me see. Question to anybody over 40. Do you think that the world has become a more stressful place over the last 20 years? How many of you would say yes to that? Okay. I think that's a majority. Some didn't raise your hand. Either you are under 40 or you were not forthcoming. It's funny. I mean, that's the general consensus I get when I ask people. That's a general response I get, that it feels more stressful. Although sometimes I wonder, what was it like living through World War II, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, or whatever, So maybe there's different kinds of stress. But I suppose there's a particular kind of stress going on these days related to some of the stuff on the slide there: pace, information overload, complexity, uncertainty. Anyone heard of Brexit? Uncertainty, again, antagonism towards faith. Do you think there's a greater antagonism towards faith, or a stronger questioning, or a stronger challenge to long-held beliefs? And all that, I think, comes together to perhaps make life more stressful. I think. How many of you feel sorry for our young people and what they have to contend with? The pressures that they seem to be. And it's a different kind of pressure, but still, they need our help to navigate some of this stuff. Okay. Definition of stress. You know what? My eyesight isn't great, so I'm going to turn a little bit here to look at that. A state of... This is one definition of stress. yeah? A state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. In the true sense of the word, it's a neutral concept, so it's not automatically good or bad. It depends on what you mean and what context and what good stress, bad stress. Very famous, anyone that's psychology would familiar, there's a very famous stress performance curve which simply says that actually stress depends on how much of it you're experiencing and how you cope with it. That can determine whether you are under-stressed, under-stimulated, under-challenged, or whether you're over-stressed and overwhelmed and overburdened and burnt out and fatigued, yeah? Or are you in the zone? Are you at a level where you've got enough stress to challenge you, to kind of spur you on, to inspire you even? So stress, not automatically a bad word, It's how we manage and how we react to it. Definition of anxiety. So anxiety probably has more of a negative connotation instinctively, but again, depends on context. A feeling of worry, nervousness, unease about something with an uncertain outcome, a reaction to stress, worry, or fear. Now, context then is important when it comes to anxiety. Yeah? So, if there was a saber-toothed tiger loose in Maze, and you happen to come across it, I would hope that you would be having an anxious reaction to that, to enable you to react appropriately, i.e. run for cover, or fight, or whatever you do to stay alive. And that's inappropriate to the context. Now, if you had that same reaction to a spider, actually, I don't know if that's the best example because that can be quite debilitating. Actually, anyone here afraid of spiders? And I did this talk a few days ago, and I kept talking about spiders, and you could see some people squirming in their seat and thinking, don't even talk about it. But if you had the same sort of catastrophic reaction to something which you really shouldn't have, maybe a rabbit or a puppy, then that's when it becomes a problem. Yeah? So it's the context. PTSD. If you've experienced a major trauma and you're in the initial period, you have all sorts of emotional reactions. Hey, you're not abnormal, That's what happens. You're a human being. You face these things, But then, 15 years down the line, if you have the same reaction when somebody whispers your name or when you see an image of that traumatic incident, then that's a problem. So the issue of context is important. And then some people say, the actual feelings of fear and excitement are very similar. So again, it depends on the context and how you interpret and how you react to those feelings. Symptoms of anxiety. This is one way of thinking about them. I won't go through every single one, but a good way of categorizing physical, psychological, and behavioral. And they're all important. So anxiety is not just a mental thing. Anyone who's experienced any kind of anxiety knows it involves your body. In fact, from head to toe, actually. And it also certainly affects your behavior very significantly. So those are anxiety symptoms, and then there are anxiety disorders or anxiety syndromes. This is when things become more severe. This is when you get recognizable patterns of troubling symptoms that have a marked impact on a person's life. And there are different names and different categories and different diagnostic or diagnoses and diagnostic criteria. So just some of them to throw up. Some of these names you may have heard before: panic disorder and social anxiety disorder, OCD, PTSD, regarded within the broader family of anxiety disorders. So to come back to that concept, that spectrum between symptoms and syndrome, which is not black and white. We're not talking about some very clear line which you cross. You go from being symptomatic to having a disorder. You go from being non-clinical to clinical. It's a lot more gray than that. But generally speaking, there is a difference between somebody who experiences some symptoms and is able to, manage and get on with life and do what they normally do, and they're not overly distressed by it, between somebody who is experiencing more severity of symptoms for a longer time, causing significant distress and impairment of day-to-day function, and perhaps leading to some risk behavior, or risk of harm to self, or even harm to others sometimes. So we part of clinical work, part of clinical assessment involves trying to distinguish between what are a collection of symptoms that could pass with general support and time without over-medicalizing and over-medicating, and what needs, prompt professional input, medication therapy, and so on. And that can be tricky. So those are some of the factors we consider. I've highlighted the distress and the function is, I think, two things that are useful. If somebody is very distressed by their symptoms, and if somebody is clearly not functioning at the level which they're capable of, and they're dropping down in terms of their day-to-day functioning, those are significant signs that this could be a more significant problem. The issue of seeking help. So, to a Christian audience, the first thing I would say is there is absolutely no shame or stigma in coming forward and talking about difficulties you may be having and sharing with somebody and seeking help and going to the GP. Christians are not immune to mental health problems of any kind. I would argue sometimes Christians might be even more immune to some forms of psychological distress, because we can set even more unrealistic expectations on ourselves than people who don't believe in a holy and sovereign God. So point being, there's absolutely no shame in talking about things if you're having difficulties, and asking for help and seeking help, especially if you're very distressed by it, especially if it's affecting your day-to-day life, especially if it's severe and persistent and so on. Avenues for help. Most cases go through in the NHS system, go through the GP as the first point of call. There are people in more acute distress. We live in a country that has 24-hour helplines, which is a blessing. So in theory, it's possible to actually make contact with another human being 24/7, which is quite a developed system of care that we have. There are all sorts of challenges in accessing help. Waiting times can be too long. It's not always possible to get to the right service the first time round. You might have to get referred somewhere and then re-referred somewhere else. So there are all sorts of challenges about that. which maybe we can talk later. But the main thing I wanted to say is, if a person needs help, if you need help, don't hesitate to come forward and share that with someone. Mental health training, we are drilled in the concept of the holistic model, and thinking broadly about the human experience. So biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. Now the spiritual is not so much in secular practice, but in this context, it's those 4 areas that we think about. So if I'm seeing someone, if I'm assessing someone, if I'm planning treatment, I'm always automatically thinking broad. Now what might be contributing to this person's problems, physically, biologically, genetically, psychologically, upbringing, adverse experiences, family relationships. The social context, very important. People's accommodation and work and financial status and interpersonal relationships, and then the spiritual side of things. So I'm thinking about all those things to try and get a broad view of a person's problems, and then how they could be helped in each of those areas. Difficulties arise if we have a too narrow understanding or appreciation of someone's difficulty. So if you only just think biologically, this is all about chemicals and neurology and neuroscience and medication, then that might help to some degree, but it's not a fully orbed approach to a complex problem. Similarly, if Christians just think this is a problem with a lack of faith, and you're not praying hard enough, and you're not reading your Bible enough, and you're not fellowshipping enough, and if only you did those things, then you'll be fine. Again, it's an unbalanced view of looking at someone with anxiety and mental health difficulties in general. Similar point. So whenever we plan treatment, we think broadly, we think holistically about the different areas that potentially could be targets for interventions of different kinds. A few points about medication. Lots and lots of different types of medication, even for anxiety, lots of different types of anxiety medication. Medication can be very helpful. In fact, in some cases, it's essential and necessary for a person to be stabilized, even to be able to start working on their problems or engaging in counseling or therapy in a meaningful way. Not a sign of weakness if they are required, so there's no place for Christians to think, taking medication means I haven't trusted the Lord enough for healing or deliverance, and that I'm somehow having a substandard approach to my problems. Not at all. However, medication needs to be properly prescribed, following adequate assessment. And if there's a clear clinical indication, then that's fine. And if there isn't, then that's also important to take on board. It's in our NHS system, because it's generally one of demand outstrips supply, so it's easier to start people on medication, but actually harder to keep everybody under review at appropriate intervals to be able to decide whether they still need it. And it wouldn't be uncommon for somebody to be started on medication and then 2 years down the line, simply because there's been no structured review of whether they still need to be on it, just remain on it because that's what they do. And in those cases, it's definitely worth having a proper review. Do they still need it? Is it time to try a gradual reduction or not? with anxiety and depression, caution about stopping medication too early. The general advice to prevent relapse is to persevere with it even after feeling better and even after returning to a normal level of functioning. 6 to 9 months of normal functioning, of feeling better, generally is the general advice before coming off it. So now and again we see cases where people think, okay, I'm feeling better after a few weeks, problem sorted, stop the medication, and then there's a relapse not long after. So we need to watch for that. Therapy. Many different approaches. At last count, 230-something different types of therapies and counselings and approaches. Some focus more on the here and now and dealing with the current symptoms. Others go back in time and look at the origins and the past and underlying conflicts and so on. And different things suit different people at different times. Now, with therapy, there is to me anyway, there's a very clear potential philosophical clash between secular psychotherapy, secular counseling, and the Christian faith, in that secular counseling will, by its very nature, not consider God as part of that. In fact, even the human spirit per se doesn't factor into things. Change comes from within yourself, or even, by manipulating your environment or your relationships, and there isn't space for that vertical factor. And, that's problematic if your overall aim in life is to grow in the Christian way and to become more like Christ and to grow in spiritual maturity. So, in those cases, I think you're having to supplement. You're having to supplement therapy, if it's secular, with spiritual growth and spiritual counsel and pastoral care and pastoral counseling. Because good psychotherapy, good therapy, even of a secular kind, can be immensely helpful. For somebody who's never even been able to tell their story in detail, in a systematic way, to an empathic listener who has skills in understanding what's going on, even that itself can be so therapeutic and so healing, whether you're sitting in front of a Christian or not. So I won't despise non-Christian therapy. There's a place for it. It can be very helpful. But if your goal is spiritual growth as well, then you'll need to attend to that perhaps through other forms of help. Now, what I want to do now is to just go through a few concepts behind stress and anxiety and bring in some biblical thought and spiritual kind of slant on those areas. So the first one is this idea about stress and anxiety being a mismatch between resource or even perceived resource and demand, or what you're having to cope with, whether it's stuff coming from the outside or even stuff arising from the inside. Anxiety arises when we believe, or when it's actually true, that we have more on our plate than we can manage, and more that we feel we can cope with, and we begin to feel overwhelmed and afraid and fearful, so therefore, the task of helping people is to, help them cope better, be able to build resilience, to grow in their ability to manage stress, to find ways of dealing things. to manage environmental pressures if it's possible, if there's too much on, to cut back, and so you can work on both ends of that balance. So great hope. The Christian life brings great hope in terms of this resource issue, because what is the Christian life? It's the invitation, it's the call, it's the ability to know God, to be in His presence and to receive from Him His strength and His enabling and His empowering. Now, that is quite something by way of boosting internal resources. I'll take that any day. So the strength and the power of God on the inside of us to face what's coming our way, I think is something that Christians can live into. As someone said, there's really, if you think about it, there's nothing that comes my way which God and I can't handle together. That kind of idea. This quote, I think it's attributed to Viktor Frankl. Anyone familiar with that name? Holocaust survivor, psychiatrist, wrote a lot about finding meaning in suffering, and between stimulus and response is a space. Yeah? And this refers to the fact that things happen to us, yeah? But we also react to what happens to us, or we react to what's going on around us, and the reaction to what goes on around us is often more important than what happens to us. Yeah? I mean, oftentimes what happens is we can't control. Things just happen to us that are outside of our control. Whereas, how we perceive, how we respond, how we choose to interpret what's happening is more within our control. And that's where the difference can lie between coping and not coping, between calm and panic. Our brains, very simple diagram of the brain. By the way, the brain isn't multicolored like that, there's just for illustration. Our brain develops from bottom up. So as we mature, as we grow, our brains develop more sophisticated as we go on, and it takes a while for us to develop, to have a fully developed brain to be able to make wiser and well-informed decisions, and of course, life experience contributes to that. But a lot of stimulus comes into our brains, and it filters upwards, and it needs that split second to get to our higher centers so that we can think and reflect and have a measured response to what's coming our way. And if not, we're left, if we don't allow that to happen, we become more reactive or more reflexive and more instinctive, and we start reacting to things without thinking about them. Yeah. So there's a little gap between stimulus entering and it hitting the higher centers of our brain to be able to be processed well. Now you're talking very, very short spaces of time, but it's important that we learn how to make use of that space, of that time, to process, so that we become more reflective than reactive, so that we can consider things more carefully and not just jump in with an immediate response. Anyone heard of mindfulness? Mindfulness? This is the basis, or one of the bases of this whole mindfulness movement, which is basically about slowing down, taking more notice, don't judge everything that comes your way, think about things, attend to the moment, be present where you are, And it's about slowing down and allowing information to be processed more carefully and more accurately as well. So Psalm 46, yeah, be still and know I'm God. I'll be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted in the earth. Christianity has known about mindfulness for a long time. In fact, I argue that mindfulness is fine. There are lots of very good things to learn from it. But if you want ultimate mindfulness, then, get to know Christ. Because it's not just, the ability to actually be still and invite God into the moment. And allow Him to speak into the situation, and allow Him to guide your thoughts and feelings and reactions at that time. Again, it's something that's available to followers of Christ. Another concept, tying in rhythms of grace. Matthew 11:28-30. Some of you will be more familiar with the other translation. Yeah, come to me, all you who are weak and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Learn from me. Take my yoke upon you, and so on. Eugene Peterson, are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. A book's written about that, and with that title. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. So, there's something about learning to live with that cadence, with that rhythm of being united with Christ. As we go through our day, learning how to lean on Him, learning how to consult with Him, learning how to depend on Him as we go about our business, bringing Him into every situation. And to me, that helps. That's a good thing. It helps us to see things clearer, and to have a more, I think, grace-filled response to what comes our way. Another concept, feel the fear and do it anyway. Again, this is the basis of a lot of modern psychotherapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy uses this principle of anxiety is something that if you don't face and go through, it gets bigger and more difficult to manage. Yeah. So avoidance is the worst thing you can do with anxiety. Yeah. It might be the best thing in the short term, but it only works for a while. It doesn't resolve the problem itself. Let me try and explain that strange graph there. So the usual anxiety reaction, if you're anxious about something, or if you're faced with an anxious stimulus, your anxiety levels go up. Yeah. The usual state of affairs is if you can hang in there long enough, if you can persevere, if you can cope, if you can get through, if you can persevere, over time, the anxiety can level off and then subside and reduce. And until you have that experience of that happening in the face of a feared response, you're not going to believe it. You're not going to experience it for yourself. You're not going to know that you can still survive after 10 minutes, after 20 minutes, and still carry on with your life. So in the mind of an anxious person, as the anxiety goes up, you think this is just going to keep going up and up and up and up and up and up and up until catastrophic levels, and you're going to go crazy, die, faint, collapse, vomit, whatever. And then because you think that you try and do something quickly and straight away to survive and to bring the anxiety level down quickly, often by departing from the situation and avoiding the feared stimulus. And that helps in the short term, so it brings your anxiety level straight down quickly. But what you don't learn is how to face it and go through it, and that you can survive at the other side. If you bring it down, your core belief remains: if I didn't do this, if I didn't intervene by running away, it would have got a lot worse, and something terrible would have happened to me. And thankfully, I got out in time. And that's how you can get. If you do that long enough, if you do that 1,000 times, then you can imagine how that becomes an automatic response, and you get stuck in the cycle of fear. That's how a phobia develops, and you never quite learn to get through. Whereas, so if you're having therapy for that kind of problem, you'll be gradually exposed to a feared stimulus and be helped to stay with it until the anxiety lessens and you can have the experience of coping. Now, Word of God has a lot to say about fearing not, be bold, be strong, fear not, for I am with you. I think it's the most frequent command in the Bible, is that right? To fear not, and to face things, knowing that God is with us and God can help us to do so. Another concept is anxiety as a warning signal. So just like a warning light on your car dashboard points to something else that needs attention too. Yeah? Anxiety is often a warning signal. Hang on, stop, pause, think, pray, consider what's going on. What's your body trying to tell you? What's your mind trying to tell you? And if you see it like that, then it becomes a bit of an adventure, even. Not just something to be fearful of. A lot of people get into the trap of being anxious about being anxious. So they start off feeling anxious, and they think, "Gosh, I shouldn't really be feeling anxious. I'm a Christian, full of the Holy Spirit." And then they get anxious that they're anxious. And some people take it further. They become anxious because they're anxious about being anxious. And the whole thing can go on and on and on. And it really leaves people in a bind. Whereas, you say, "Okay, hang on, I'm anxious. What's going on? Lord, teach me, show me what's going. Help me to know understand what's happening here. Help me to get some perspective on what's going on, some wisdom on what's going on." So I think it's a stimulus to prayer. It's a prompting to prayer. So in moments like that, the heart turns upwards, the mind turns upwards. Don't be anxious about anything. In everything by prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. And I've highlighted that part of that verse, let your requests be made known to God. You can focus on all parts of that verse, but there's something about just being able to let your requests be made known to. It doesn't say let your requests be answered by God. Let God give an opinion on your requests. Let there be a positive outcome to your request. It's simply saying, learn how to let your requests be made known to God. And I do this a lot. I have a particular request. It's help, help, help. Don't know what to do. Help, give me wisdom, give me wisdom, give me wisdom, give me wisdom. In all situations of life. And we have the privilege of being able to do that. And even just the act of letting our request be known and leaving our requests with Him, with no definite answer forthcoming even, I think there's something in that. Responsibility, control, trust. At the root of anxiety, there are often issues about, how responsible do you feel for your own life? How much do you think you're in control of your life? How much do you think you can affect the lives of other people? And if you don't have a right level of responsibility and control, i.e., if you feel too responsible for your life, anxious. If you feel you've got, or that you need to have too much control over your life, or if you think you can control life more than you actually can, and that can also set you off down a path of frustration and anxiety. And again, as opposed to now being able to trust, being able to know, now what is my responsibility, what is out of my responsibility, what is within my control, what is out of my control, and how do I rest and how do I trust in His goodness and His provision and walk in His path. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, leaning not on your own understanding. Right, coming to the end, a couple of resources about managing stress. I mentioned these two because they're the ones which the NHS also promote. In fact, that Take 5 leaflet, does anyone recognize that? Because I think some time ago, every household was sent a copy of that, and information about these 5 things which everyone can do to promote mental well-being. And actually, they're quite spiritual. You probably can't see that. Give, be active, connect, keep learning, take notice. You could easily make that into a sermon and approach that from a Christian point of view. And then the other one is the stress control program, which some healthcare trusts offer as part of their stress control approach to staff and to patients. Jim White is a psychologist from Glasgow. If I can recommend this book by Alan Fadling, An Unhurried Life, and this again talks about having living with those rhythms of grace and knowing how to rest in Him, knowing how to work, but also to work from a place of assurance and from a place of rest even. So I found this very helpful. I'm told for one night only by the Faith Mission people that this has been discounted from £14 to £10. So can I recommend that to you? And then finally, there's a table at the back with a list of resources on the topic of Christianity and mental health. So books, websites, articles, service organizations. You can also purchase a copy of a book that I wrote called Personal Freedom, which is about how the gospel, properly understood and applied, can have a positive impact on a person's mental health. So that's at the back as well. And then the gold standard for resources on Christianity and mental health is the Mind and Soul website, which is packed full of resources on this topic, and it's run by a pastor, psychiatrist, and psychologist, which reflects the aim of the organization to have good integration, a thoughtful integration of Christianity and psychiatry, psychology. That is all I have to say on that part. Thank you for your attention. I'll pass you back to Annette.